Okay, welcome back, everybody. This is going to be another exciting Drawhouse design drawing commentary video. This particular project here is less about a finished illustration that is a deliverable product in its own right. It's just an exercise in concept art. This is a character that will appear in my comic book Mindfold. The character doesn't appear until way later in the comic book, but I like to concept stuff out early on just so I know what's coming down the pipeline. But as with all concept art, I prefer to start with the most basic building block of the artwork, which is going to be coming up with the basic silhouette of the object. What I'm doing here is pretty. It's a little bit too basic for my tastes. Like for my own notes to myself, I like to see kind of what kind of a silhouette this outfit, this character is showing, just as a pure black and white thing, but anyone can look at this and imagine whatever they want. Like, who the hell knows what those squares and ovals are? I tend to add a little bit more, just very slight grayscale information there as well, just to make it a little bit clearer what those actual shadow figures are. But right now, I'm the way that I'm developing these silhouettes is that I know that this character, it's in a science fiction comic book, and this particular alien species has some clearly specified characteristics in that they're evolved for long distance running, and they have these very short torsos and long limbs. So the main reason why I came up with that particular set of criteria is because a species that would be evolved for long distance running and have long limbs and a short torso would pretty much look exactly like a fashion illustration. And since fashion design, fashion illustration is something I like to do a lot, I figured why not develop conceptual characters that look like fashion illustrations so I can have more fun designing their outfits. So that was my extremely self-indulgent rationale for coming up with these particular types of characters in this particular science fiction comic book. So I just completed doing 8 little silhouettes. I've chosen 3 of those to develop further. The nice thing about a comic book is that it's very rarely just one character doing a bunch of stuff. There's usually a whole bunch of people in the background and other secondary characters. So the nice thing about having those 8 very rough silhouettes and now these 3 slightly more developed silhouettes is that as I come up with background characters or I need to fill out scenes, I've got a whole slew of alternate outfits all ready to go. So these will not just sort of get tossed in the wastebasket. They'll continue to live on my hard drive. So if I need other outfits for the same set of people in the story, I can just develop those other silhouettes from the past, and I'll be ready to go with more stuff. And this is sort of what I was talking about earlier, where that just black and white silhouette is usually not enough for me. I like to have a little bit more explanation of what those shapes are doing, what they're arising from. And So now those sort of big square boxes are not just some sort of cube that is resting on her shoulders. It's actually like these exaggerated lapels and kind of a large belt with a cropped jacket coming through it. So this is the stage where I'm just starting to add those kind of very rough details, because it's my opinion that going from just the black and white silhouette right into a much more refined piece of concept art is like a huge leap, like going just from a shadow to all sorts of details immediately. It's too hard to this is, I mean, I'm just the client here myself because it's my comic book, but if I'm doing work for other clients, if they see a black and white silhouette and then all of a sudden it's kind of developed into a fully rendered sketch, it's just too much of a conceptual leap, and there's too many opportunities for the client to say, well, wait a minute, we didn't expect that. Where did this come from? Let's go back to the drawing board. So I like to do silhouettes that have a little bit more of an indication of some of the different surfaces and some of the different kind of parts that conspire to create that black shadow shape. So I've taken these three partially selected silhouettes, and I've taken one that I like best of all those three, and that's going to start to become what will eventually be the final drawing. And by become, it doesn't mean I'm just going to refine exactly what's there. I'm still fine-tuning a lot of stuff, and I'm still changing a lot of stuff. Like, for instance, that I kind of liked that wide-brimmed hat, but then I decided that the character is going to start to look, I don't know, maybe like a mariachi player, like half expecting her to whip out like one of those really big guitars and start playing some sort of music, and that's definitely not what the character was about in the story. So I'm sort of going back and forth, like maybe is it this vaguely cowboy hat thing, or is it more like in those small, very small silhouettes you can still see there on the right, they're more like these shrouds that you might see a Bedouin desert person wearing, and that's kind of what I ended up doing. Was it's more like a headscarf or some sort of almost like a hood, but it's like a scarf that's wrapped around the head and neck and has more of a drapery. And also you can start to see, like I'm starting to define some utilities for these details. And I've skipped ahead quite a bit here. I wasn't going to record just all of the noodling, but you can see I've started to define what those details mean. So for instance, like those wide lapels are now these sort of storage areas for some cylindrical cartridges. This character has like this sort of flintlock rifle, and there's like storage area for the powder charges for those, and there's a belt, and there's a bunch of other sort of secondary belts that are draped around her waist with mostly like jewelry and decorations, but it's sort of a, sci-fi steampunk comic, so maybe there's those things all have some sort of functionality, which I don't really know what it is, but it doesn't really matter. And this is actually now moving into the inking phase of the whole drawing, which is only showing up because this is a concept design for a comic book character. If I were doing concept designs for, let's say, video games, or possibly even like uniforms for people in an exhibit or something like that, for like real world design, the that black and white line work wouldn't really be helpful because the end product doesn't have that, and having this highly stylized outline would throw people off, especially in video games, because there are very few video games that render their characters with this this ink line. It's usually just more of an attempt at a photorealistic rendering, and for those kind of projects, you'd want to use a more painterly or photorealistic style to communicate the concept. But in this case, I'm sticking pretty closely to the comic book vernacular for two reasons. One is because audiences understand that very well, and they'll receive it very well, and they'll understand what's going on. And the other reason is that if I were to start hiring other artists to jump in on the production line, so like maybe I'm doing the pencils and inks and someone else is doing the coloring work, then doing the standard comic book pencils, inks, color process of doing a comic makes it easier for me to pass it off to other artists so that they can complete the drawing. Whereas if I were to do just a very painterly style, like a piece of video game concept art, I would have to do all the artwork by myself, and that in comic books, that's not always practical for an artist to do all the art themselves, because the way that comic books are able to succeed is by volume. So you have to put out a lot of issues per month or per year or whatever in order for the readers to remain interested. And the only way to do that is to have a team of artists rather than have one auteur sort of sit in an ivory tower and produce, one issue a year or something. That's just no audience is gonna pay attention, is gonna keep interested in something that comes out so infrequently. So I'm trying to stick with a style that that other people can jump in and take over if that were in the works. So I've completed the ink work. I'm starting in on the color work, and right now what I've done is the flats. So I've just put in my local colors, no rendering, no lighting, just what those objects would be if they were lit equally from all sides. And those flat local colors are now going to be the basis for starting the rendering process. So I'm going to start with a new layer in Photoshop with the blend mode set to multiply, and I'm going to use that as a shadow layer. So I'm going to start with everything being very dark, a lot darker than where I want to end up, but I'm putting in all of the shaded parts of the object, and now I'm going back in on that layer. It's actually I'm using a layer mask, so I'm going into the layer mask, and I'm starting to erase shadow from that layer to create the more specific lit parts of the object. So my shadow layer started out treating that entire object, the entire figure, as one giant cylinder or one giant sphere. And now I'm refining that, because even though that is kind of true, that the light is coming from the left and the figure is generally kind of cylindrical, I need to fine tune that now and add a few things like wrinkles or cast shadows or some of the specific geometry that is modeled by the light, such as the kneecaps or the knuckles on her fingers and face and stuff like that. And now I'm kind of going to do the opposite, where I'm going to start adding things that are lightening those shadows. And in this case, I'm adding in my my reflected light. So these are not the key light. The key light is the sunlight coming in from the left, but on the other side of the figure, there's going to be ambient light, which is defined as the word implies, light that is everywhere in the scene. It's like that sky still illuminating part of the figure on the right, but it's much less strong than the sunlight. So you don't really see that ambient light unless there's no sunlight to sort of wash it all out. And now I've added a third layer mask that is starting to beef up the key light. So now you have your shadow layer, your ambient light layer, and your sunlight layer on top of each other that are all creating like an influence on that initial flat layer, which was just the local colors. And what I've done now is I've copied all of those layers. I've essentially collapsed all of those 4 layers down into one layer, and I'm just using straight up painting to refine all of that stuff. So this is pretty much no different than just using acrylic paints on a canvas. I'm just painting right into all of those different colors that resulted from all of those blended layers from the beginning, and I'm just adding refinements at this point and kind of beefing everything up. So generally always with comic books, and I would say generally with most commercial illustration, you kind of want to exaggerate everything, like make those dark shadows really dark and make the lighter areas really blow out and give a little bloom there just to make everything like maximum drama. That's just the way to sell the concept or the art to an audience that has a very short attention span, and the comic books are pretty much optimized to appeal to a short attention span, because most people are going to look at one panel of a comic book, probably less than a second or so. So you want to really make it kind of scream out with the most extreme rendering that you can get away with. The only other things that I'm doing now, in addition to just kind of fine-tuning the lights and shadows, is I've added another layer on top of my line work that has some of my really bright highlights, and this layer now is just adding some kind of like bloom, indicating like a slight overexposure of the lens, and I'm just adding a few local textures. There's a bunch of stuff that I skipped over, but this is pretty much just fine-tuning everything. Okay, so here we have the finished image. I went ahead and cleaned up a few things, added a few little atmospheric flares, like just the background texture and stuff. So this was the local color layer that we started with at first, just with the pen and ink line work and the flats put in. This is how all of the light and shadow rendering layers all played out. Most of this was about adding shadow. Another layer that I also put in there was the screen layer, so that's the screen layer turned on. I also went in and put some stripes on the figure's legs. The original concept of the species was going to be that they had these sort of tiger stripes all over their body, but I realized two things. One, that having that much black on the skin tones was going to start to make the figures very dense and dark. And a more important thing I realized was that if these characters show up all over the place in the comic book, I'm going to have to draw those damn tiger stripes all the time, and it's going to eventually drive me insane. So I just reduced it down to the bottom of the legs. I don't know, there's some sort of evolutionary reason why it does that. I don't know, but it added a little bit more interest without being too time consuming. On top of the line work, I also added a highlight layer. Those are some photographic blooms and just some small little sparkles like around the jewelry and the belt items, and smaller reflective surfaces, and then another additional bloom layer that is again on top of the line work, just to add a little bit more intense light rendering. So that's the total process there. As mentioned before, sped up quite a bit. And I hope you guys learned or found some valuable information in this video. And I will see y'all next time. All right, bye.